Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We'll get started momentarily as we give a couple seconds for people to log on. Have a great day.
Good. Good morning, Boston. Good evening, Taipei. My name is Steve Goldstein, and I'm the director of the Taiwan Workshop at Harvard University. This is the second in a series of meetings that we've had to talk about the November 26th elections in Taiwan. The 9-in-1 elections that'll be for mayors and magistrates in major cities down to the village level. This year, there'll also be a constitutional amendment lowering the voting age from 20 to 19. On Tuesday, a couple of days ago, we heard from a presentation from the major parties. Today, we're going to hear a panel of analysts on the elections. And on December 7th, we'll have a postmortem meeting talking about the results of the elections. Most analysts have drawn a distinction between the two sets of elections. Local elections are said to be shaped by local issues, the strength of local organizations, and frequently family ties, while presidential and national legislative elections are shaped by island-wide organizations and policy issues, especially mainland policy. This appeared to be the case during the last local elections. In the last local elections, the Kuomintang opposition defeated the ruling DPP badly, only to be defeated itself a year and a few months later in the presidential and legislative election. That's the basis of the frequent organization. That's the basis for the frequent argument that the two elections are fundamentally different. But there was a clear connection even last time in terms of, first, the emergence of the Kuomintang presidential candidate, Han Kuo-yu, who ran in the local election and suddenly, and suddenly became the presidential candidate in the island-wide election. Secondly, as a result of the defeat, Tsai Ing-wen resigned as chairman of the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party. And it's said this year that unless the Kuomintang does well, that Zhu Lilun, who's the chairman of the Kuomintang, will have his status and possible presidential candidate status in the party damaged. And of course, thirdly, despite the fact that this is supposed to be local elections on local issues, the mainland question looms strong over this election. And if I could just inject something that I've been thinking for the last couple of days, it seems to me that the recent apparent, I wouldn't call it warming, the recent apparent improvement in U.S.-China relations is possibly going to have an effect on these elections, simply because there are indications that some members of the opposition, the Kuomintang, are using the improved relationship between the United States and China as a way of arguing that the Democratic Progressive Party, President Tsai's policy towards the mainland, is too harsh, too negative in terms of the mainland during a time of apparent improvement. So it allows the Kuomintang, which has a so-called China-friendly attitude, perhaps to gain some traction in this local election. Anyway, I've said enough. Let me introduce the panel. The panel is Sarah Newland, who is at Smith College, and she is a Taiwan specialist and mainland specialist. Jiahong Tsai, who's from National Chengchi University in Taiwan, with the Election Studies Center, one of Taiwan's most prominent pollsters. Lev Nachman, also at Chengchi University, has written extensively on these on the elections as well as on Taiwan's domestic politics. So, Sarah, if you could go first, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. I'm going to just fill in a little bit more detail in, sort of following on from some of Steve's comments to lay the land about the 9-in-1 elections and how they're run and sort of why they matter in Taiwan. And kind of leave the horse race aspect of these elections to the other two panelists. So as Steve mentioned, these are elections for multiple types of seats, all of which are some version of local government. The biggest prizes are the mayoral and county magistrate races. These are pretty big players in Taiwan. I think the most relevant comparison case in the US is probably not mayors, but state governors in terms of their importance, and also in terms of the fact that these folks are often kind of waiting in the wings as potential candidates for national office. So they're important races to run, not only because they are, running large cities or counties with, a sizable population in some cases, but also because some of these folks are potential presidential candidates for 2024. City council races are also going to happen in these upcoming elections, as are races that move to sort of ever smaller levels of geographic detail and precision. So township mayors, folks who are kind of the equivalent of like a neighborhood warden or a block captain. And, these races, I think in some cases have a reputation for being kind of personalistic, but they're also the folks who do a lot of the kind of bread and butter work of local governance. So, the people you would call if the streetlights are out on your street or there's a pothole, right? That those kinds of races are up for election. And then finally, there is a referendum on the ballot, which would change the voting age in Taiwan from 20 to 18. And so that is something that is, a chance for citizens to sort of vote on policy directly. This has been really an important development in Taiwan in the last few years. There was an election last year in which there were several referendums on the ballot, and referendums also played a big role in the 2018 local elections that Steve mentioned. In part sort of driving the electoral failure of the DPP. So I want to talk a little bit about how these different elections are organized. One of the things that makes them a kind of complicated set of elections to talk about is that the different elections have different electoral rules. So for the mayoral and county magistrate positions, and also the some of the more local level positions like the sort of township head. These positions are what political scientists call first past the post elections, which means a bunch of people run for them and whoever wins the most votes wins the seat. It doesn't matter if they win an outright majority of votes or not. Whoever wins the most gets the seat. The city council elections are somewhat more complicated. They are run by something that political scientists use an awkward acronym for this, the Single Non-Transferable Vote Multi-Member District, SNTV MMD system. And so this is a system where a given locality. So a city would be divided into districts. Each district is allocated a certain number of city council seats. When voters go to the polls, they vote for one person for their district, and then the top X number of vote getters are elected, right? So if a given district has 5 seats, the people who get the, the first through fifth highest vote getters win those seats. And so this is a kind of complicated electoral system. I think it creates some incentives that can be a little bit, they have some upsides and some downsides. It has created an opportunity, I think, for smaller parties to kind of enter the political scene in Taiwan and win some seats, because you can win one of these elections with, in some cases, just a few thousand votes. But it also, I think, in some ways privileges the larger parties who can afford to run a whole bunch of different candidates, and also who maybe have a better, sort of more developed ground game in terms of deciding where to allocate resources, where to allocate candidates, because they need to think, of course, about, if there's multiple seats up for election, are they going to win 3 seats in one district, or are all the voters just going to vote for the one most popular candidate, and then they will have sort of wasted resources on running some other candidates? And so, I think this is a system that can, kind of has some upsides and some downsides. So, and then in the referendum, a majority of eligible voters in Taiwan have to vote in favor for that to pass. So that's a pretty high bar. And so what I think we might see, I'll leave a more detailed discussion of this maybe to the other panelists, but I think it's entirely possible that we would see a situation in which there's fairly widespread support for this referendum, and yet it might not pass. So there's, not really been like strong opposition from any major political party to the referendum. If you look at polls, I think on the whole, a majority of people support them, but are you actually going to get a majority of eligible voters turning out to vote yes? I think there's a good chance that, it will not pass just because that bar is so high. So as Steve mentioned, I think the presumption about the local or the, local midterm 9-in-1 elections, those terms all get sort of used interchangeably. I think the presumption is that they run according to a pretty different logic than the national elections, which will next occur in 2024. And as Steve said, in the national elections, the cross-strait issue is really front and center in voters' minds. In local elections, voters are voting more on sort of local governance issues. So, is the mayor doing a good job of providing basic services to us as citizens? I think there are some reasons why. So there's I guess a couple of different reasons why we see that disconnect. So one is just that people are voting on different, sets of issues, right? The things that the president is responsible for are different from the things that your township mayor is responsible for. And so those kind of economic concerns, in some cases, social policy concerns too, like in 2018, the gay marriage issue was really important in the midterm elections. So that's not as much of like a bread and butter kind of daily life issue for many voters, but it was made salient in lots of voters' minds. But, in general, I think these tend to be largely driven by people's satisfaction with the quality of local governance. And so I think this is part of why KMT candidates, I think, are probably poised to do reasonably well in this election, even though I think in the national elections, the KMT has a real messaging problem right now, which is that their fundamental message on China is not appealing to many Taiwanese voters, and its appeal is declining over time. But in the local elections, voters aren't voting as much on the cross-strait issue. And so if they have a KMT mayor who they think has done a pretty good job of governing their city, I think they're willing to vote for that person. And we shouldn't necessarily interpret that as evidence that, the KMT is likely to perform extremely well in 2024 in the next presidential election. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that those different electoral rules, especially for the city council seats, mean that small parties can compete and win seats in local elections more easily than they can in the national elections. It's slightly more complicated than that by the fact that the national elections have a proportional representation component, which also has been somewhat favorable to some local candidates. But in general, I think it's been easier for some of the small parties that emerged after the Sunflower Movement to elect candidates to city councils than it has to elect them to some of the national level positions. It is still, I think, hard to see with the first past the post rules how some of those parties might become successful at winning something like a city mayoral election or a presidential election. It seems like, there's strong pressures for a kind of two major parties to be primarily competing against each other for something like the presidency in a way that makes it hard for some of the smaller parties to compete. At the same time, I think, as Steve was saying, the local elections do have some important implications for national politics. And I want to talk about a few different ways in which they do. So one is that mayoral elections are an important testing ground for potential candidates for national office. 3 presidents of Taiwan, former presidents of Taiwan, all served as the mayor of Taipei. So that's a really good example of something where being mayor of a major city, obviously, is, kind of helps to position you potentially for the presidency. Steve also mentioned the KMT's presidential candidate in 2020, Han Kuo-yu, who was sort of vaulted to a position of national prominence by winning the mayoral race in what had been a traditionally DPP stronghold in Kaohsiung. And then he kind of swept into office and people immediately started talking about him as the potential KMT presidential candidate. He turned out to not be a great candidate, but I don't think that was necessarily clear at the outset. And there are several candidates this year on the ballot who could potentially be contenders in 2024. In the presidential election. I think a second way that local elections can matter for national politics is that they can be kind of a test of the popularity of a new party. And so I think a good example of this is Mayor Ko Wen-je, who is finishing his second term as mayor of Taipei, has been kind of building a party organization, the TPP. And this is kind of a test, I think, of whether the TPP will have appeal beyond Ke as an individual, because the TPP is now running several candidates for mayoral races. And, I think whether it's a party that some people have talked about as a potential real third party challenger to the KMT and the DPP. But I think they have to sort of prove that they can win some of these like big races, or at least compete for big races and at the mayoral level in order to show that they might have any kind of viability for national office. And then the third point I want to make, I won't talk about this too much because Steve mentioned is that I think local elections can be a referendum on national party leadership. So in 2018, I think the local elections really punished the DPP in part because people were dissatisfied with some of the policy choices that the party was making at that point. That punishment didn't last very long, in part because the Hong Kong protests, I think, really raised the sort of salience of the China issue in people's minds. And the DPP wound up obviously winning in a landslide in the 2020 elections. But, I think we can sort of look in some ways at these results, if they're disastrous for the DPP, I think that might lead to a sort of change in direction or a little bit of rethinking about what's going to happen next, especially given that Tsai is not going to be eligible for re-election anyway in 2024. And then the last thing I'll say, I want to leave time, obviously, for the other folks, is I think local elections in Taiwan are interesting to watch because they both highlight the sort of vibrancy of Taiwan's democracy, but also some of its remaining challenges. And, these are obviously now this is a system where top to bottom leaders are elected. People really care about elections. Election season in Taiwan is really like exciting and fun. Taiwan election rallies are kind of like rallies nowhere else I've ever been. And so that is all great. I think there are still a couple of sort of weaknesses with Taiwan's democracy that are really highlighted by these local elections. One is that in every set of local elections, there are accusations of corruption. There is currently a scandal sort of involving one of the TPP's mayoral candidates who's being accused of sort of misuse of funds and mistreating her staff. And, there have been kind of other corruption issues, often in the ultra local races. Accusations of vote buying remain really common. And so those, I think, are issues that they aren't necessarily more serious in Taiwan than they are in lots of other electoral democracies, but I do think that they are a little bit of sort of a remaining flaw in some of the local races. And then I think the other issue that's really important to watch is disinformation and fake news. This is something that people really started talking about in the 2018 elections, that part of the popularity of Han Kuo-yu was driven by fake news, some of it sort of produced by mainland Chinese producers and then spread by gullible voters in Taiwan. And so, I think that this is kind of a testing ground for the degree to which Taiwan can protect its media environment and ensure that voters are getting accurate information and using that as the basis of their decisions. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Sarah, thank you very much. I forgot to mention in the introductions that all three of our speakers today have connections with Harvard. Sarah and Lev are part of the Taiwan Workshop, and Jiahong is spending a year here as a visiting scholar.
Okay.
So I should also, I can't resist adding that one of the corruption issues in local politics this year has been plagiarism on both master's and PhD theses. And I think it would help if some of our local candidates wrote a few more master's and PhD theses, but that's another issue. Please.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Okay, thank you for having me in this workshop. And so I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Let me see. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry. No. Sorry about this. Listen, sharing. Yeah. What happened to you? Share? Okay. But oh man. Let me see. What happened?
I don't know.
Sorry. Let me figure out. I thought I already have it. Too bad. Okay. Let me quickly find the slides.
Maybe Lev could go next.
I was going to say, I don't know if she'd like.
Okay. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Yeah, great. It's the right one. Okay, thanks. So thank you, Steve, again, and I'd like to share some of my observation in these local elections. Okay. So I'm going to talk about some background, some issues, and some challenge, and some all problems for polling in Taiwan. Okay. So as Sarah has mentioned, the background is local elections will be held actually next Saturday, and about 90 million people are eligible to vote. So the turnout rate could be I don't know, could be 70%, around 70% according to previous elections, but we will see. And right now, KMT is holding 50 city mayor or county mayor, DPP 6 and TPP 1. So lots of people are talking about how many seats can DPP hold on, and because most KMT incumbent mayors have high popularity. I mean, according to the polls done by magazines, we found that most of KMT incumbent mayors are popular. They keep low key to counter the DPP challenges, even though the DPP sent many current legislators to challenge the KMT mayors, but they just keep saying that we are doing very well, so there's no need to change, right? And I think the DPP government is not credit for funding the local government, even though the DPP government have some legislation to have more funds for local government to do like museum, libraries, or sports center, but it seems that the DPP strategy is not working out very well. So it's expected that most of KMT incumbents can win their re-election. But we can also see the DPP is very strong at southern Taiwan, such as Jiayi, Tainan, Kaohsiung, Pingtung. Those are so-called deep green districts. But it seems that DPP struggle to keep Keelung, Hsinchu, and Taoyuan. But you know, we have about 7 days to go before the election, so a lot of things can happen. And right now we are not allowed to talk about any popular opinion polls, so it's hard to say whether or not people have changed their mind or they have decided. Right, and one of the major reasons is that the DPP cannot coordinate nominees in New Taipei, Taipei, and Taoyuan City until September. So, as Steve just mentioned, there's some plagiarism issue. So, the DPP has to change the nominee of the Taoyuan City at the very last meeting. Okay, and the Taipei and New Taipei are also a little bit controversial because someone wants to run for someone wants to run for Taipei City Mayor, but he was sent to New Taipei after all. Okay, so the most important national issue is related to COVID-19 pandemic, because the KMT keep arguing that the DPP government failed to save more lives, and they failed to manage the quarantine of the airplane pilots. But KMT also criticized the DPP for purchasing not enough vaccines in the beginning. So you can see people in when the pandemic broke out in 2020, people have panic for mask. Then we have panic for vaccine. So Chen Shizhou, who is the DPP Taipei mayor candidate, and also the commander of the CDC becomes the top target. Also, the DPP tries to rally voters with resisting China, protecting Taiwan, 抗中保台 slogan, and then the KMT condemned the DPP for provoking China, and then they say that cooperating with the US while engaging China is for Taiwan's best interests. So the recent development between between China and the United States seems to prove the KMT's point, but right, but I think we still have to observe the effect. Okay, and some economic issues like inflation, economic development, corruption, and energies are not very salient in this local election. And Sarah just mentioned the constitution amendment referendum, and unfortunately, it seems that no party is really seriously campaigning for the referendum, even though it's the first one since we abolished the National Assembly in 2005. Okay, and you still can see people have different opinions as to lowering the voting age to 18. Okay, so I also want to talk a little bit about young voters, because the conventional Western state, the DPP can have very strong support from the young voter. But it seems that even though the DPP remains the most popular party in terms of party identification in the polls, some young voters seem to lose zeal for the DPP. I think they still prefer independence, but some of them are not very satisfied with delayed reforms such as inflation, housing price, and the social inequality. I think Taiwan needs to do best. They need to do better. On the other hand, the TPP, the Taiwan's People Party, gained some momentum by emphasizing clean politics and good governance, especially during the pandemic, because Taipei Mayor Ke Wen-je is also the founder of the TPP. And about the KMT has gradually recovered from the 2020 presidential election and 2021 for better referendum. So right now, KMT's major strategy is changing the DPP governance, especially the shortage of mask, vaccine, and rapid test kits. So basically, I think KMT is using kind of like a negative campaign to attract voters, and but I think the DPP may need to do a better job to persuade people that they are doing a good job. Okay. And so I'm going to switch my focus to the polling, and you may see many polls before the election, and because but I think there are some questions or some issues need to be think about. But first of all, the coverage rate of the household telephone survey is getting lower. So I think it's not easy to get enough sample size from a single county city for local elections. So we see some polling companies adopt internet survey and on cell phone via text message. So basically, their strategy is to send text message to many people and asking if they can join the panel to do internet survey. So the consequence is that there are many non-probability samples in data, and you may also wonder if there is any more effect. So some people some people do the survey on telephone, but some people do a survey on internet platform. So I wonder how they combine different sources of data and even do the weighting. And then you can also see some companies tapping to website member data bank, right? And of course, there's non-probability samples. Okay, and some surveys finish a survey in 2 days, and to cover more districts or to make the news. So you can imagine there's a selection bias. So they only talk to people who are always home. Okay, so some polling companies combine prior election results with survey results for household and internet samples to make election forecasts. So there are very, very complicated formula to take previous election results and the census data and the current survey result and some internet sample adjustment to make forecasts. But I think there are lots of non-random errors, not just bias but error. So of course, there are challenges for polling, not only in Taiwan but also in many countries. But in the 2022 local election, I think we can imagine that many people right now are moving from Taipei City because the housing price is too high to Hsinchu and the Taoyuan City, and that's why Taoyuan and the Hsinchu City are also getting more and more populated. But they may slightly change the electoral map in northern Taiwan. The reason why I say that is because Taipei City, I think, will become more and more polarized because only senior people can stay in Taipei City. But Hsinchu and the Taoyuan City are quite like a swing city. So they may explain why the DPP is struggling to control Taoyuan and Hsinchu City this time. But we can also reflect the election maybe 8 years ago when KMT lost Hsinchu and the Taoyuan cities. And furthermore, after COVID-19, echo chamber effect gets stronger and stronger because people don't contact each other in person, and instead they rely on information from in-group, from Line or from Facebook. So people are not likely to answer posts or show up in campaign rallies. Okay, I think He Zhiwei 2 days ago in the workshop, in the workshop series 1, he also said people don't really show up. They many, compared 10 years, 2 years ago or 4 years ago. So in this section, Sarah just mentioned, it's also hard to identify any key issues like plagiarism scandals and even DNA. So it's difficult to verify responsible intention or use issue position as a process of their preference. So when we want to break down people who refuse to answer, we just have very few clues, right? And then the proportion of non-partisans is around 50%, which makes also difficult to draw information from non-response. Okay, that's my last page. Okay, and the long-lasting problems in Taiwan's polling is well, first of all, we overestimate the turnout rate. So if you look at the results, you will find that the turnout rate is so high, but actually I think there's some kind of like a 10% difference, right? So we have to be cautious about the turnout rate. And we also have institution effect. So some media have their own surveys, and the political party also announced their survey results. But you can imagine that the political polarization is very severe, so there must be institution effect. And you can imagine that some voters may refuse to answer questions raised by some media or companies. So sometimes the media has to pretend that they are asking questions for some professors. So it's very ironical, but it's true. So there's always concern that polls are used to make news. So when there's some news and erupting, the media may want to do a poll very quickly to reflect people's sentiment about the news. But you can imagine that people there is some priming effect there, right? Okay, the last problem is the refusal rate. So many people may refuse to take any review to avoid the phone scams, especially. I'm not sure if you heard about the Cambodia scams stories recently. So lots of people are thinking that they can have a like a gold rush to Cambodia, but it turns out they are all scams, right? So many people refuse to take any phone, and I think they will cause lots of selection bias as well. Okay, I think the concluding remark is that we have to think about the turnout rate, and we also have to think about how to take care of institution effect. I think if we can continue to use multiple label model that use past voting results to model the response in a national sample survey, can predict local election, and try to fix the problem from there. My colleagues and I has done that before, but we have to think about it with the latest census data and the survey results as well. So I will recommend both pre and the post-election surveys to explain voting behavior and to interpret the election results. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you.
Jiahong, thank you very much. Now, can we get the screen back?
Okay, I'll stop share. Okay,
There you go. Okay. Lev, you're up.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you very much for organizing this panel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the issues are with this midterm, why it kind of matters, and kind of what's at stake for each party. Also, please excuse my very American-centric use of the phrase midterm. I know local elections is the preferred nomenclature. My brain automatically goes to midterm since America just had its midterm. So I want to start by talking a little bit about this common wisdom that in midterm elections, voters care about local issues. And I don't really know what that means, because what are local issues and what are the local issues that people are voting on in the midterm? Because if you just compare 2018 to now, the issues are so radically different that it really feels that, this kind of common wisdom of local issues is a really idiosyncratic kind of thing from midterm to midterm, which only makes explaining what motivates voters in local elections all the more difficult. In 2018, you had Hangul, you had marriage equality. In 2018, you had 10 different referendums that were all really confusingly worded. This time around, there's no Hangul, there's no large list of referendums. And so, the headlines and the things that people are discussing are so very different. So I think it's important to remember that, what exactly motivates voters on midterms isn't particularly well known. What's also interesting, we have so much public opinion data on national elections. We know very well and very confidently that on national elections, people vote on cross-state relations, the future of Taiwan, China, but we don't have a lot of public opinion on what motivates voters during the midterm. So I think it's just important to know that this is a known unknown, that we don't actually have a ton of good data on what drives local election voting. But that doesn't mean we can't know what are the important issues during each local election. So what's driving local elections this time? The headlines are not about who's offering plans to fix the roads or to help fund communities. It is scandals, scandals, scandals. That has really been the central issue all over Taiwan. It's not just a Hsinchu problem. It is a problem everywhere. In Taipei, there's scandals over whether Jiang Wenan is really Chiang Kai-shek's great-grandson. That dominated headlines for a while. In Miaoli, one of the mayoral candidates has been accused of murder. That's another scandal. One of the mayoral candidates in Geelong was accused of bribery, I think. And then, of course, there's the thesis scandals in Taoyuan, which ever since Tsai Ing-wen was accused of having her dissertation plagiarized or faked or something. That's just become a go-to tactic for like every political party. And it's really become a mainstream way of attacking. And this is not a partisan way of attacking a party. We see both blue and green camps trying to find any sort of hint of corruption and swing that at their opponents. It has become the go-to strategy of this local election. And it really is hard to think of places where there is not an example of corruption being talked about. Even earlier this month, Tsai Ing-wen in a speech, said, we need to push back against Heijin politics. That seems like something out of the 1990s, but that's still, what's being talked about. Then there's the elephant in the room, and perhaps the number one question that I get asked is, so how is China playing into this midterm? And the answer is it's kind of not nearly as much as people think it is. So of course you have Chen Shizhong in Taipei really hammering in on this Kangzong Baotai kind of slogan, and it doesn't seem to be really picking up a whole lot of steam. There was one poll from My Formosa, which is a more green-leaning public opinion outlet, who asked respondents what they think the most important job of a mayor is, and one of the options was, protecting Taiwan from China, and only 8% of respondents thought that was their most important job. That's not a perfect measure, but it's kind of a data point for us to look at, whether or not voters are really seeing this whole, Kangzhong Baotai issue really being an important driver in the local elections. I really don't think it is, despite Chen Shizhong and some members of the DPP really trying to make it a local issue. The reason they want to do that is because that's become a very successful electoral tactic for them. We saw that in 2020. The more they lean into this idea of Kangzhong Baotai, the better the DPP did. But we're not seeing that being a successful tactic this time. I think the DPP has kind of learned its lesson that you can't copy paste one election strategy into another and assume that it will go perfectly well. So I'll talk, because I don't want to go for too long, so we have plenty of time for Q&A. I'll talk about what's at stake for kind of each major party. So with the DPP, this is a really, really big election, because the forecast, before you read, there's a law in Taiwan that I think it's 10 days before the midterm, you can't talk about public opinion polling in public anymore or do any more public opinion polling. So we're kind of going blind on how people feel. But before now, the polls for the DPP were a bit more pessimistic. And if the DPP does poorly all over the north, so and kind of the DPP worst case scenario is losing Taipei, losing Keelung, losing Taoyuan, losing Hsinchu, and losing New Taipei, but I think that was pretty given. If the DPP does very, very poorly, there will be an expectation that Tsai Ing-wen, as the party chair, will ceremoniously step down. And if she steps down from party chair, it's going to create a new internal factional dispute within the DPP. And that's going to have very real implications for the 2024 nomination primary and a kind of whole outlook on their election process. The reason now it's important to kind of remember that like she has to step down a year from now anyway, because she's not going to be president anymore. But this really kind of speeds that forward. The reason this matters is because currently the front runner is Lai Ching-te to be the next DPP nominee. But as we all remember, in 2019 or 2020, Lai challenged Tsai for the nominee, for the nomination. And it's not so much, it's kind of the DPP's open secret that faction fighting is happening pretty intensely right now. And that those in Tsai's faction are not super keen on Lai necessarily becoming the next president. There's a bit of a push to have a alternative candidate. The kind of rumor is Chen Jianren, the former vice president, being the championed person to compete against Lai Ching-te. And if Tsai has to step down, and if Tsai's faction becomes very marginalized as the result of this midterm, then Lai Ching-te has a much easier time getting the nomination. And that's why this is a kind of important at stake deal for the DPP. And for some of these races, I think it's kind of known that they're not going to go well for the DPP. Like again, New Taipei, Hou You-yi is just such a popular mayor that Lin Jialong really does not have a good chance. So for that race, it's not so much if Lin Jialong loses, but like by how much does he lose? Because if he gets say 40% of the votes, that's an amazing race for him. But it's really kind of and it's similar to some of these other races as well. For the KMT, of course. What's really important to remember, and this is kind of goes along with the question of how does China matter? The KMT doing really well in this local election is not indicative of them doing really well in 2024. Nor, and this is perhaps the line I've said the most, nor is the KMT doing well a reflection of Taiwanese fears of the August Chinese military drills. On paper, it would look like, in August, we had all these Chinese military drills. And then in November, you have the KMT doing really well in election. And a lot of people are eager to kind of make a link between those two things. And we should not do that because that would be wrong. The KMT's victories in a lot of these races can be explained much better and much more convincingly by what's happening locally and domestically than by anything related to do with the Chinese threats, which by and large have not been part of kind of local discourse here in any way. At least in regards to the local elections. Now, that being said, Jiang Wan'an is a very strong candidate. He ceremoniously stepped down from his position as a from the legislative yuan to run. And I think he's definitely going to have his eyes on the future as a presidential candidate potential if he wins this mayoral race. It would be a very big victory for the KMT. Now, of course, if the KMT does poorly and then Eric Chu, Zhu Lilun, the current party chair, is going to have a much more difficult time, kind of rallying troops for the 2024 election. And the KMT is also facing its, fair share of factional disputes. All parties in Taiwan are run by factions. That's just kind of a common truth. Now, of course, Hou You-yi is the most popular KMT candidate just from polling. But it's not a sure thing that Ho will be the presidential nominee because Ho and Zhu Lilun don't always identify as being a part of the same faction, to put it nicely. And so really, the KMT's performance is also going to be just as indicative for the nomination process and who we should expect to see shortlisted for 2024 as it is with the DPP. So next is the TPP, Mayor Ko Wen-je's party. And there is the common wisdom that this is the party that young people support. I'm sure there are plenty of young people that do support it, but just by the sheer number of votes that they got in 2020, I think it is important to remember that it is not only young people voting for the TPP, because they are getting a lot more of kind of the light blue older votes as well. And we also know that just because young people don't vote that much in Taiwan, they're the lowest voter turnout rate, and that's true of all democracies. So the TPP is probably getting some of that young vote, but they're also getting votes from somewhere else. And I'm guessing that's also from light blue voters who are feeling disenfranchised by the KMT as well. Now, Huang San, I'm so sorry. Now, Mayor Huang San-san, former Deputy Mayor Huang San-san is a very strong candidate in Taipei. And there is a very real chance that she could win. Gao Hong'an in Hsinchu right now, despite the scandals, because that hasn't stopped candidates from winning in the past, has a very good chance of winning. So there is a potential in which the TPP actually wins 2 mayoral races in this local election. There's not a super high chance that both will win, but there is a chance. If the TPP gets both mayoral victories, then the odds of Ko Wen-je running are just through the roof. Like it's pretty much a sure thing. Now, Ko Wen-je might run no matter what. That's a very real possibility. But Ko Wen-je running with 2 TPP mayors versus Ko Wen-je running without any mayors, or that's those 2 very different kind of setups for his potential presidential run. Now, if he does run, and he has a strong backing, that means that 2024 is going to be a 3-way race between Ke and 2 other candidates, one from the DPP and one from the KMT, which is going to be a very messy timeline for us to deal with and have to explain when 2024 comes. So finally, I must say something about the new power party. So they are not nominating as many people as they did in 2018 because the New Power Party has been going through some number of growing pains over the last few years. But they have nominated still a good number of local city council candidates. And they actually have 3 different mayoral candidates, one in Geelong, one in Miaoli, and then one in, oh goodness, Pingdong, I believe, but forgive me if I'm messing up that last one. I think they are hopeful to be able to get some number of city council seats. As Sarah noted, it really is kind of a prime way for small parties like the New Power Party to keep their foot in the door, even when they are not able to grow as much as they would like. It's also worth saying something about the Taiwan State Building Party, who, after Chamboe was recalled, currently have no elected officials in office. And what's also interesting is actually the first time the Taiwan State Building Party participated in formal politics was in 2018 in the last midterm, and they didn't win anything. So they actually are yet to win a city council seat, but they have nominated a ton of people, which I really think is an effort for them to try to remain relevant and to try to show that they can still win a vote without Chamboe as being part of their party. But we're all very eager to see how those smaller parties do. I will stop there, but welcome any questions, and thank you again, Steve, and thank you to my fellow panelists.
Lev, thank you very much. We have a question that was asked by one of the members of the audience, which I think is an important question, and that's the question of misinformation. The presumption seems to be, as was mentioned by, I think, Sarah, that the mainland intervened in the last election actively, particularly in favoring Han Kuo-yu. And Taiwan also has a very active anti-misinformation movement, which could be a model for other unnamed countries to use. And I was wondering if one of the panelists would like to elaborate on that, because I think it's an important aspect of the elections in Taiwan. Anybody?
I can talk about it a little bit, and then maybe others can jump in as well. If this is a topic that's especially interesting to you, there's a really comprehensive report by the Doublethink Lab that, sort of details some of the strategies, disinformation strategies that were used in Taiwan in 2020 and in 2018. I think one of the things that's complicated about this topic is that disinformation from China is very decentralized. I think sometimes people have this perception that there's like one office that's sort of directing lots of information into Taiwan or potentially into the US and other places. And that's not really how it works. There is a combination of, individual sort of nationalistic Chinese citizens generating content that then is picked up by people in Taiwan. There are content farms that are, in some cases private, in some cases government or military affiliated in China, that are creating fake news and disseminating it. And then there also is an issue that is now, not an especially new issue in Taiwan, but the question of sort of red media in Taiwan and, pro-China formal media outlets that are in close communication with mainland Chinese media and are kind of like parroting their messages. And so I think one of the things that is complicated about, stopping the spread of disinformation is that it's coming in through multiple channels, being sent via multiple actors, and then also disseminated via a lot of different platforms. So if someone is sharing incorrect information, propaganda with relatives in a line group, that's hard to stop, right? And that is a different. So there's that kind of like social media influence, things like YouTubers that are sharing sort of it's kind of complicated. It's like in some cases it's explicitly supporting a particular candidate. In other cases, it's kind of sowing doubt about the value of Taiwan's democracy in general and kind of trying to maybe depress turnout by raising people's doubts about, whether democracy has served Taiwan well. In some cases, it's sort of like amplifying messages around how great a job China has done at something and how bad a job the Taiwanese government has done at that comparable thing. And so, there's really, I think, a sort of vast landscape. Taiwan has been fairly active. So in the last election, there was a group that was I think set up basically by former Taiwanese journalists who then founded a nonprofit that was trying to sort of combat this. Other folks jump in if I'm misremembering, but they were going through and actually, people would flag Facebook posts as containing disinformation, and then this group would vet it and was in collaboration with Facebook, where then something would show up if they determined that it was fake. If someone clicked on that story on Facebook, the story would be sort of grayed out, and there was like a message over it that would say, oh, this is, has been determined by independent experts to be fake news. Are you sure you want to click on this story? And then also, I think people who repeatedly reshared fake news, they like stopped showing up in other people's Facebook feeds as much and stuff. So, there was a level of kind of, I think, Facebook was open to, or was working with this group more actively in Taiwan than I think would ever be possible in the US, just because of the kind of regulatory environment here. But, so I think that there has been a sort of active effort in Taiwan to address this issue in a variety of ways, but it is a little bit like a kind of whack-a-mole problem where there's just so many different sources of information. And, Taiwan is a very open society and a very wired society, and there's lots of benefits to that, but it also means that there's lots of potential entry points for someone who might want to, share fake news or try to use social media to influence an election, for instance.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Lev?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'll second Sarah's recommendation for Think and the Doublethink report. So the Doublethink report is really great for showing how many different ways that we can see disinformation. One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind, though, is that, the Doublethink report shows all these different ways that disinformation were present in the 2020 election, and yet Tsai Ing-wen still won by a landslide. So even though there's disinformation, it doesn't seem to have a very big effect on voter behavior, or at the very least, it didn't in 2020. What I think is a frustration of mine personally is there's always a desire to talk about Chinese disinformation and not about disinformation in general. We often forget that in 2018, the marriage equality referendums were plagued by disinformation. And that disinformation didn't come from China. That was homegrown disinformation from Taiwan. Things like, if we pass marriage equality, all your kids will get AIDS, and all these other just really horrendous fake reports that were not started by China. They were started in Taiwan. And really, that's a reflection of just how susceptible Taiwan can be to disinformation, regardless of where it comes from. But ever since 2018, I think there have been so many groups that have become incredibly vigilant to the ideas of disinformation. And especially after the 2020 election, I really think that shows that a lot of these tactics that, many people in the PRC may have thought would be a viable way of pushing votes away from the DPP don't necessarily work as well. Even though we can still see that they're happening, the effect on elections, I think, is kind of to be determined more.
Okay, thank you. Jiahong, I have a question for you.
Okay.
One of the recent events in the United States with polling was that there were a number of affiliated polls towards the end of the election that misled a lot of commentators and were basically tools of political influence to try to shape the voters. We always, when we see Taiwan polls, it's always identified as pro-green or pro-blue. My question to you is, Is there really that much difference? There are so many polls in Taiwan. Many of them are identified with either blue or green. Is there really any difference in their findings of any significance?
Yeah. Thank you. Right. So I think there are many polls right now, and many polls are done by the media such as TVBS or Liberty Times and United Daily News. So United Daily News and TVBS are often considered as pro-blue news media, and the Liberty Times. Liberty Times is quite pro-green or pro-independence media, right? But United Daily News and TVBS are more constantly doing survey and announcing their results, right? So other than that, you still can see some polls not very affiliated with news media, such as Formosa 美丽岛电子报, I don't know how to say that. Formosa newsletter. Right. Thank you. And so they also constantly announcing their poll results, but the person who run the organization is a little bit controversial, because he used to be Wu Zijia. He used to be a DVP member, but right now he criticized DVP and Tsai Ing-wen a lot. What I try to say is that of course we can see some affiliation or see some connection between the poll results and the posters, but it's hard to say their polling are very skewed or overestimate a particular candidate. Right, and the point is that because the government doesn't allow any polls 10 days before the election day, so it's not easy to verify the poll results and by the election results at the last minute. So you can always say, because something happened in the last 10 days, so our polls can be a little bit biased or can be wrong. But so my argument or my recommendation is that we still have to keep in mind that some pollsters want to I don't think they really want to skew the result and to mislead voters, but they maybe unconsciously overestimate or over-report the supporting rate of certain candidates, and that's the demand side. I mean, the supply side is that some voters or some respondents also want to strategically or very intentionally to influence the poll by taking or not taking survey from their out group, right? Or from their in group. They are, I think some of them. Well, I can make an example. So maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, when Hou Xiuzhu was running for the KMT presidential primary. She got lots of support from the telephone surveys, but she's very extreme, right? She must be defeated by the DPP badly if she really becomes the KMT candidate. But so you can tell that some pro DPP responders or voters intentionally, you know, skew the results, skew the polls. So you have to, right? So right now, people are more and more cautious about the polls, and even though we don't want to accuse any posters of sending the misleading results, but still have to think about to look at the refusal rate or the turnout rate to make a good judgment.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Does anyone else want to talk about polls? We have a question from the audience, and it's about ticket splitting, in the sense that do voters sometimes vote one way in the local elections and another way in the island-wide elections? Anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, so I think it's worth highlighting that depending on which thing you're voting for, that the options you have are going to be very different. So like Sarah was talking about, in a first past the post kind of race, where typically that's only two candidates, usually one KMT, one DPP, then you often end up voting for either the DPP or the KMT. But with city council or during national elections, the party vote, you can vote for way more choices than just the DPP or the KMT. So you end up seeing voters voting for different parties for different positions. Again, just to echo what Sarah said, you might have someone who really likes their mayor, but would never vote for that party for a national election. I think that's, perhaps something we might see in some cities this term. But yeah, you most certainly see switching around. And like one of the slides said before, there's a big proportion of Taiwanese voters who are not affiliated. So, just looking at the 2020 results, the KMT got 1/3 of the PR votes, the DPP got 1/3 of the PR votes, and third parties got 1/3 of the PR votes, which tells us that on the national election, when it really mattered, there was about 1/3 of Taiwan that did not vote for the KMT or the DPP and didn't identify with them at the moment.
Anyone else on that question?
I would just add one minor, or I guess two minor things. One is that for some local seats, actually, a lot of candidates run without even having a party label. So, these party labels are super, super important in terms of national politics. And Taiwan is relatively polarized at the national level in terms of like people not trusting, people who are strong supporters of the other party. But a lot of those labels actually literally don't exist for many of the candidates who are running in these ultra local races that are on the ballot for this upcoming election. And then the second piece, I think Professor Tsai maybe can get the number more accurately down than I can, but a high percentage of Taiwanese voters are independents, right? So it's something like half of Taiwanese voters identify as independents. So, presumably, in a two-way race, those folks are voting for someone, right? But they're not necessarily going to come down on the same side every single time.
I was going to follow up on that, Sarah. The high percentage of so-called independents that don't identify with one of the parties, it's unknown in the United States. And it's unknown in many political systems for there to be this number of non-identifiers with the two major parties. What are the consequences of that for Taiwan politics? Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I can. talk about it a
Okay.
little bit. Yeah, and right. So yeah, so this non-identifier or independent proportion is really I think it's really high, but compared to United States, I think yeah, it's relatively little bit higher, and but still it's related to the level of party polarization or political polarization. So so I think so Stella just mentioned that in the national level, people are quite polarized because of course there are only two parties. Maybe there'll be three parties in 2024, but but before then there are only two major parties competing on the presidential office. So so it's not hard to imagine that people have to be a little bit polarized because there's only one seat, right? And we don't have the well, of course we have some seats in the legislative yuan reserved for the party list. So so some people indeed try to balance between major party and the minor parties, right? And even though in the same camp, right? So some people may vote for DPP in the district election and then vote for example, Taiwan State Building in a party list or vote for another one. I don't know. But they belong to the same ideological camp, right? And so you still can see that okay, the two camps or two blocks are quite against each other, right? But so the so-called independents, I mean, I think they are some of them are motivated independents. They just try to they just don't want to answer party allocation as a sensitive question. So they still will vote for either DPP or KMT very constantly, but they just don't want to answer the question before the interviewers. That's one possibility. Another one is that some of them are waiting for party queues or waiting for some group queues especially in the national level election, and I think I think most of them are still following the line of national identity, right? And especially in the 2020 election, right? But maybe things will change, and I think people talk about party realignment 2 days ago. So maybe TPP will become stronger and stronger, and the three-way race will become a little bit more balanced. We will see, especially after the local election. But if nothing changed, I think people still follow the line of national identity, which is you are exclusive Taiwanese or you are dual identity. So right, so my theory or my argument is that Taiwan is still very polarized, but maybe it's not like it's not as a cultural polarization like United States. People can still talk to each other, and people are not so effective polarized. But in terms of election or in terms of parties, I think Taiwan remains polarized. But maybe in a good way, or not so bad way. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just tag on. I think it's important to remember that independent doesn't mean that they don't have an opinion on Taiwanese identity or an opinion on unification independence. They most certainly do. And I think it's just a matter of their perception. I mean, political parties in a place like Taiwan have such a qualitatively bigger meaning than, say, the United States, because they represent these platforms that have sway over the future of Taiwan. That I think like identifying with them is such a very big part of one's identity if you identify with the DPP or the KMT, that I think that just makes it different than, say, the United States. But I will totally echo the sentiment that especially after being in the US last year, it feels like the United States is far more polarized than Taiwan days, which is saying a lot because Taiwan's a pretty polarized place. And just in the spirit of the Wudang people who run, I was just handed this on my way home by a independent candidate who calls himself the rock and roll professor, Yao Guanjiao So, who's running for local city council. So you see plenty of independents running as well.
One of the things that came out of the meeting that we had a couple days ago with the representatives of the various parties was that when it came to identifying issues, they almost identified the very same issues. Inflation, cost of living. It seemed that there was sort of uniformity in the problems that each of the parties see. And yet, that makes me think that voters are not necessarily issue voters, because the same arguments are being presented by these two or three parties. But rather the issue is something else. Is it party loyalty? Well, that doesn't seem to work, because the Kuomintang gets more than its very small percentage of identification. There must be some sort of underlying, it seems to me, disidentification with something that makes voters, given identical platforms, to choose one or the other. Does that make any sense? Lev, how would you explain that?
Yeah, so in Taiwan, when the main political cleavage is not left-right in the way that we think of it in the United States, it's instead this fundamental issue of who are we and where are we and what's our future going to be. That means that things like policy plans don't motivate voters in the same way. That doesn't mean voters don't care about policy, but that's not what really is going to drive people to support a candidate or not. Now that's much more true, especially during national elections, but say for local elections, really my read on all these thesis scandals and the corruption scandals left and right, they're very, headline grabby, and they might seem silly to a degree, but really I think it's a reflection on people evaluating the quality of their candidates, and not just the quality of the candidates, but the quality of the parties that these candidates come from. Because it's not just an attack on the candidate, it's an attack on the party system or the party that's boosting these candidates. And I think that goes back to identity. I think really it is a fundamental reflection of identity and party identity. And again, in Taiwan, the DPP and the KMT aren't just parties, they are the parties. Where to accuse someone who's a member of the KMT or a member of the DPP of corruption is not just a reflection of the individual candidate, but the bigger party itself.
I think this also, I think this goes back to Professor Tsai's point before about how the KMT is running mostly on a kind of anti-DPP or critical of the DPP platform. And, in some ways, I think it makes sense that they're doing that because the DPP has been really dominant in politics now, despite the losses in the 2018 election. I mean, they really have, dominated the national scene, obviously, for the last 6 years. And, and so I think it makes sense that in some ways the cleavages are not around parties talking about different issues, but more just the KMT saying, we don't think the DPP has done a good job on these issues, rather than carving out, kind of a separate ideological set of focuses for themselves. I think Lev's point about the fact that there isn't a clear sort of left-right spectrum on social issues between the parties, or even really clear policy identities for the parties, setting aside the cross-strait issue, is another really important point. And then the last thing I'll say is, I'm a little surprised we haven't really talked at all about identity and kind of the historical roots of these parties. But I think that that's something that's really important to think about as well, that the DPP is a party that really emerged out of the democracy movement. It was supported traditionally by very different kinds of people, right? Much more of a local party than the KMT, which was traditionally more of a kind of outsider Waisheng party. And so, I think in some ways those old distinctions between like Waisheng and Bencheng are less important than they used to be. But I do think that the kind of family histories that people are bringing to their support for a political party remain really important. And, just as in the US, if your parents are Democrats, then you're pretty likely to be a Democrat too. I think that's true in Taiwan, with this added element that, these two parties are intimately tied to Taiwan's development as an independent place over time.
Thank you. Well, thank you all to all the panelists. I've learned a lot from this session, and we're very appreciative. There'll be another third session on December 7th, as I mentioned, talking about the results of the election. And although they don't know it yet, I'm going to bring this group back. And this will be recorded. Of course, this will be available on YouTube. And we'll see how we all did. Thank you very much, really. I appreciated this, and I hope the audience appreciated the quality of discussion that they heard. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Fun. Yeah, so you are in Zhengda, right?
I'm at Zhengda. I'm Silo, so it's very nice to see you in person. I hope
very
that
nice. It's first time
when you're
to
back
see
in
you.
Taipei, I would love to spend some time chatting.
Sure, yeah.
I hope you enjoy your year in Boston. I'll see you when you're back.
Thank you. Okay, bye.